welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome. This is Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast, and I'm really excited today because our guest, our author, has written a historical fiction novel called The Sister's Suite, which is super cool and also has to do with twins. That's not the main focus of the story, but the main character is a twin, and as a mother of twins myself, I always gravitate towards that. Yeah, I know, right?
Cool.
Why don't you introduce yourself and tell everybody, our listeners, about the book and the plot?
Sure. Well, the book is about a set of twins whose parents make them pose as conjoined twins in a vaudeville act. And then when they're about 15, one of them exposes that this is a fraud, so she can sort of escape the act and run off to Hollywood by herself and become a movie star. And then really the bulk of the novel is the story of the sister who's left behind and has to figure out what her life is going to be and who she's going to be without the act and the relationship that have always defined it.
So first of all, what a cool time period to set a book in. Vaudeville in general has always fascinated me. Where in this process did you automatically know you wanted to write a book about that time period?
I didn't. That's an interesting question. It's sort of a strange path that I took to get to vaudeville. So the very first seed of this story was actually this bizarre incident that happened about 10 years ago. I don't know if you remember this. There was this family in Colorado that had a large balloon tethered outside their house and it got loose one afternoon.
Yes,
the balloon boy. Yes,
balloon boy.
Yeah. So I'll explain really quickly what happened. So this balloon got loose and the family had a 5-year-old son and they couldn't find him anywhere. And he'd been playing around the balloon earlier in the balloon's basket, and people became worried. His parents were worried that he had gone up with the balloon. And there was this huge search and rescue operation. The balloon was kind of spotted flying high above, Earth, and people were terrified for hours that this little boy had been taken up in the balloon. And then ultimately he came down from the attic and he'd been hiding all along. And then later that evening, they were on CNN being interviewed, and I think it was Wolf Blitzer asked, why didn't you come when people called? And he said something like, my dad told me not to. And it became this huge scandal where it was thought that the parents had done this all as a hoax to try to get a reality TV show. And the story actually becomes more complicated after that, but it was that idea that
they actually in a reality TV show at one point.
I'm not sure. They had been on like that wife swap show where a family, like a mom went to the two moms switched places. They had some background in reality TV.
Clearly attention was not something they were trying
they didn't mind. They didn't mind getting. Yeah. And I was just really interested in this idea of like parents who would use their child in that way. And they were convicted of some crimes and have just been, like last winter, I think they were pardoned. So the story gets more complicated. But for me at the time, I was really interested in this question of kind of parents using their children to commit fraud to get famous, and like what would that feel like and how would that kind of impact a child psychologically. And so the very early stages of the novel for me, I was actually writing about characters of the 80s, and they were fake conjoined triplets, and they were getting ready to go on the Phil Donahue show, and it was like a very different kind of world. It didn't work at all.
Completely different.
And I actually ended up in vaudeville, trying to figure out how could I make this story work. It seemed much more plausible that a family could get away with a fraud in a long-term way in that time and place than where I had originally started out. So yeah, to answer your question, I didn't start in vaudeville. I kind of found my way there after I sort of first imagined a family in this situation. And then vaudeville seemed like a world in which I could write that story and talk about these people and kind of explore what that life might have been like.
So it's really funny. So first of all, the main character is Harriet, and she is the twin who was left behind. Josie, or Josephine, her twin sister, And I know, like, I've read some comparisons to Gypsy, where you have like the one sister who really went off and became famous, and the other one, well, one can argue that Gypsy really is the more famous one these
Yeah,
days.
ultimately, right.
Nobody's really writing musicals about June, they're writing them about Gypsy. But Harriet is really like, so to kind of quote a movie that just came out on Disney Plus, Encanto, she is like the Louisa of the family. For those who have not seen Encanto, Louisa is super strong, but confesses that she feels that her worth is like what she can take on for the family. And I got so much of that from Harriet. And then at the same time, I just want to really quickly circle back to how you mentioned that there was that 80s connection in your original story, because thinking about it, the talk shows of the 80s in a way were I don't want to say they were the vaudeville of that time period, but they certainly were the sideshow of that time period.
It's a good comparison. It's a kind of like human spectacle, and like, yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good comparison.
Absolutely.
Sure.
And a lot of the people who were doing it were complete frauds too.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
110% frauds. But so, I mean, it is definitely classier to set a story about this in the vaudeville time period. But what I love about this story is that it is so much about stage parents and about, just like how it affects their children. It was interesting because I think pretty early on, you could tell that Harriet and Josie's mom was not really into this whole idea, even though she herself had been in the Follies.
Yeah.
But the dad more so.
Yeah. And I was interested in writing about stage parents, but I wanted to explore that kind of relationship in a way I hadn't seen before. So their mother is kind of a reluctant stage mother, and it is their father who's kind of driving things, but his motivations, I think, are complicated. And it's not a super functional family, but I think I do think it's a family in which people are trying to do their best. They just don't necessarily have the tools to really have that be something good. so yeah, it's these parents each have a background in the theater, and they're trying to kind of work through some things in their children's lives and in their children's kind of lives as performers. So yeah, it's kind of a multi-generational theater family, and the things that their parents experienced when they were young sort of resonate through their daughters' lives and stories. So I was definitely fascinated in that idea of stage parents, but also just, I don't know, it's kind of like the family psychology and how those four sort of play off of each other, and each of them is playing a role within the family in the same way that they're playing a role on the stage, and how they kind of play out those scripts or kind of defy those scripts becomes sort of the big question of like, how are they going to live their lives? Will they kind of play the roles that they've been written, or are they going to write their own story? And so yeah, there's definitely a play between kind of the family psychology and the kind of psychology of the stage.
Yeah, for sure. And it is interesting, just sort of in the girls' lives themselves, how one of them, like a moth to a flame, just flocks towards more fame, and kind of notices that the fame that their parents have chosen for them is holding her back, or and in the case of Harriet, it's really all about supporting the family and less about necessarily what she herself wants. So it's interesting how they ended up in show business because of parental wishes, but one of them willingly continued, and the other one just was trying to figure out, okay, well who am I, because this was all an act, but it was an act for my family. So totally. That was, yeah, absolutely, that was pretty interesting and a really good question, because I think it's universal. You can read a story about this taking place anytime. And I think that, siblings will have these questions. So I think it's relatable in that way.
Yeah. And in each family, even if you're not on the stage, we have ththese roles in these scripts, like whether it's even in a much more functional family, maybe it's like the big brother is, the smart one and the little brother is the nice one, like these roles that we sort of kind of just grow up, we're formed by this little cluster of people that we sort of find ourselves part of.
So again,
that was one of the things I wanted to explore.
Yeah, no, it was good. And I think I think in historical fiction, it needs a good balance of research and also character. And I think there's going to be a lot that readers are going to find here that they're going to enjoy, because it's got all of that. So the research that you had to do to get into this. So prior to this, is this your first fiction novel?
It is. Yeah, it's my first book. Yeah.
Yeah, you had written some nonfiction prior.
Yeah, I've written just a few short pieces that are online, but this was really my first book and my first novel. Yeah.
So did you do a lot of research, and
yeah,
was it difficult? Did you find yourself looking at endless ads for different acts?
I did look at a lot of ads for acts. I mean, I did a ton of research. I really worked on the book off and on for a decade. So there were a lot of years and a lot of times where if I found I was, it was kind of like this give and take between the research and the writing. So sometimes I was really, really focused on the research and doing it in a sort of intense way. And it was just like, I went on like a research trip to Chicago, and there were times when I was just like really deeply in the research side of things. And then other times where I would be kind of more focused on the writing and maybe just kind of dabbling in research here and there. But it really was throughout that 10-year period, it was always a little bit of research going on.
Yeah.
And it was so fun. I found so many just kind of fascinating resources, books that kind of brought to life different parts of the story, the vaudeville stuff for sure. But then also once we kind of settled in Chicago, I found this amazing book that was a sociological study of the near north side of Chicago that was conducted in 1929.
Oh, wow.
And so that's the neighborhood where the book is set. And it's just a series of interviews that these sociologists did with people who lived in this neighborhood, which is a really remarkable neighborhood that had an amazing combination of residents. So it had one of the very richest kind of areas in Chicago with these very like fine, fancy families. And then it had a section of the city that was really occupied by like young men and women who are going to work in the Loop, and they just needed like a boarding house where they would live and just have like a small room. And it was kind of affordable housing for these young men and women, single people who are working in the city. And then the slum, which was, one of the poorest segments of the city, all within just like a very small, just a couple square miles. Oh, and then like the Bohemian district, which becomes an important part of the novel. So all of this was kind of mixed together. And this book was just an incredible resource because I heard the voices of the people who lived there. And I got to see inside their apartments and houses, and just all of these wonderful, rich details about what their day-to-day lives would have been like were right there in their own words. So that was an incredible resource that I found. I spent a lot of time just digging through old newspapers, which I loved, just again for like those little day-to-day details that would be hard to find in a history book. So even something as simple as the weather report, sometimes if I was stuck at a scene, I would sort of be like, okay, like we're in 1931, it's July, I'm just going to go to, find a newspaper from, July, a Thursday in July in 1931. And I would just find a little, the weather report or a little article about some random happening in a neighborhood, and just that little bit of spark about, a day in that moment in history would bring a scene to life. So yeah, the research it was a lot of work, but also just so much fun. And I think you're right, it is in historical fiction about kind of balancing that research with everything else the novel needs to do. So there are definitely times where I felt like, maybe I would come upon a really like charming detail, and I would have to kind of restrain myself from trying to work it in.
You had to kill
Yeah.
your darlings, as they
I
say.
had to kill some darlings for sure. One of the things I found was a great like a guide to Chicago restaurants that was published in 1931. So there's definitely one draft of the book where, and this guide was great. It had details about like the menus at all of these different restaurants, and it was kind of organized by neighborhoods. So there's one draft with definitely way too many, like, and they ate exactly these menu items from this restaurant that, you know, it was on this street, you know. So yeah, I had to exercise some restraint as well.
Well, I mean, you know, there's always time for another book. People like historical fiction, but you said that this took you 10 years to write?
Yeah, kind of. And it wasn't like I was writing every day for 10 years. I started writing when I was living in New York. I had a job in finance, which is a kind of random part of my background. And I ended up leaving to go to grad school, and I started the book maybe like a year before I left. And then I went to grad school and I worked on the novel off and on, in addition to some short stories and stuff. And then, yeah, for a lot of years after that, I was teaching and doing a lot of odd jobs, and then writing as well. So I think it took me a decade because I was learning how to write a novel in that time, in addition to writing a novel. And so I wrote the book probably 3 times, start to finish, just entirely different versions of it. There was one version that followed Harriet all the way to the end of her life. She, as an old woman, kind of continuously, we kind of see her at the end of her life in this version, but the story really is focused on a handful of years and her kind of coming of age moment. So there's a draft that, you know, we spent time all the way through her life. Another draft that was just kind of wildly different from this one, that kind of covers the same time period but did it quite differently, and characters were different. So yeah, there were kind of 3 very different versions of the book that I wrote over that decade as I learned how to write a novel and how to write this novel, and kind of this is where I landed.
So how long did it take you to sell the novel then?
That's a good question. I guess once I worked with an agent for my wonderful agent, Rebecca Gradinger. I met when I was in grad school. So she and I actually worked together for a long time before we decided the book was done. And, you know, when we first met, I hadn't finished a draft yet. So I kind of went through that process on my own for a while. And then I finished a draft, and she read it and had feedback. And I rewrote it a couple of times with her. So we really worked on it together until we were comfortable with the idea that it was finished. And then it sold quickly after that. But there were many, many years that kind of preceded that decision that it was ready to go out into the world.
So are there any other time periods that you would like to write about?
That's a great question. I'm kind of dabbling in an idea for a new book that includes a section that's set. I'm hesitant to, I kind of am superstitious about talking about work in progress, but I will say it has a section that's set.
You can just say yes. You can say yes, and I cannot wait for you to read it when it is sold and on shelves.
So maybe I'll do that. Maybe I won't pin myself down.
Let's not jinx anything here.
Let's not jinx anything. So I'll say yes. I am exploring both past and future time periods, and the present. All of them are in the mix. So yes.
That's great. So one last question. Do you read a lot of historical fiction?
I read some historical fiction. That's a really good question. I think that that term historical fiction can be a little bit tricky. So I read a lot of books that are set in the past. I'm not sure if they would necessarily be described as historical fiction. And I've sometimes wondered about whether it makes sense to describe my book as historical fiction. I sometimes think historical fiction for me evokes like a book that is interested in like a particular historical figure or an event, and trying to kind of illuminate the history as one of its sort of primary goals.
Yeah, what an interesting way of putting it, because I suppose I could see what you're saying, versus a fiction book which is set in a specific time, but not necessarily against some, like a person or a thing that was so monumental.
Right. And I think for me, because what I was interested in first was kind of these characters and this family relationship and sort of that psychology, I found a setting where I could explore that, but that sort of came second. I did an event with Jessie, who wrote Homegoing, and she and I talked about with her book as well, Homegoing, which obviously spans many years of history, kind of struggling with that term historical fiction and whether it really described what we were trying to do. So to answer your question, I do read a fair number of books set in the past, but I'm not sure if I would describe most of them as historical fiction. I did, yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure what the answer is.
And also thinking about it, just because you mentioned in your acknowledgement that you did a little bit of research into twins.
Yeah, I do. I chatted with a friend who's a mom of twins. This was many years ago. This was one of my college roommates. I asked her some questions about her twins, and she told me several really charming little details, like that their teeth came in all the same time in the same order. She just gave me a little insight into her kind of twins experience. And my sisters-in-law are twins. There are a lot of twins kind of around my life. So yeah, I'm always curious. I'm curious about you as a mom of twins, and to anyone kind of with twins in their lives. Like, do these twins read as twin-like? Have I gotten twins right? But
yeah. No, it is interesting. Just it's a really interesting relationship that I don't think you can understand unless you are a twin.
Mm-hmm.
But it is in the way that I think, I very much recall, because for the majority of my childhood until I was about 9.5, I actually was an only child, and then my parents had another child when I was 9.5. So I have a lot of memory about being an only child, which is a little strange because I have more memory of having a sibling. But with the boys, there's always somebody else there, and they always have the other one, even though their personalities are very different. There's definitely one that's more outgoing than the other, who's okay stepping back. But they'll make these comments. Like, one of them, we were talking about how my husband and I met, and one of them mentioned, "Oh, my brother is the first person that I ever met." Like,
yeah, that's a little trippy to think about. Yeah, it's true.
Right? Like, literally and figuratively, your brother really was the first person that you ever met. So no, I'm always gravitating towards books that have twins in them.
Yeah, it's just a fascinating kind of relationship to imagine, because exactly as you say, like, most of us won't experience that, and you really don't know what it's like unless you're in it. And so that's part of it for me, just trying to imagine something that is so foreign to me and unlike my own experience is sort of fascinating, just to think about what that would be like.
I realized that I should never say one last question, because that's never the case. And like these podcasts, I always say we're more like chats than anything else. In actual interviews, we're a little bit more casual. But just thinking in general, did you always know that Harriet was going to be the person that you wanted to write about? Was there ever a chance that we would have a Josie draft?
That's a good question. I did always want to write about Harriet. I was very interested in the idea of telling the story of the sister who less obviously kind of demanded attention, and trying to see if the sorts of challenges and questions that a life like Harriet's life, a quieter life, would kind of yield, if those could sort of fill the page. And I became deeply interested in those questions. But that it was part of the spark of the book for me was very explicitly about exploring the other sister's life, the quieter sister, the one who wasn't a star.
Thanks so much. This was really cool. I know the book is out on bookshelves and on library shelves. Whether or not you want to consider it historical fiction or not, because now this is going to be completely like nagging at me every time I pick up a book and I call it historical fiction. I think people are going to love it. And thank you so much, Elizabeth Weiss, for talking to us about the Sister Suite.
Thank you, Jessica. This was a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
All right, we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.